It's the morning of August 14th, 2005. The skies over Greece are clear, blue, and calm in a way that we pilots absolutely love. And high above the countryside, a Boeing 737 is holding, but the image of a golden sun god called Helios in Greek across its blue tail. Everything about this aircraft from the outside looks perfectly normal, but something inside is very, very wrong. Over the radio, the controllers are calling Helios 522 Athens Center. You read over and over again, but with no reply. And to fully understand how this Boeing 737 could end up circling silently like a ghost plane over Athens, we need to leave the sky for a moment and go back to where this flight really began. Not in the cockpit, and not even on the runway, but instead inside of a small airline operating at the edge of Europe's newly found low-cost boom. Helios Airways was in the beginning of the 2000s a relatively young carrier by airline standards. It had been founded in the late 1990s as the first privately owned airline in the island nation of Cyprus. And it was the very definition of a scrappy upstart low-cost carrier operating only 4 airplanes. In a role familiar to those of us that know the European airline market, Helios promised to move holiday makers between Cyprus, Greece, and cities across Europe as cheaply and efficiently as possible. And like many budget airlines of the time, Helios proudly operated with thin margins, relied heavily on seasonal demand, and pushed its aircraft hard. During the busy summer months, with every aircraft needing to fly as much as possible to stay profitable. However, the airline's attitude towards safety was a little bit questionable. Turnover among flight crews and mechanics was big, and around 2005, Helios had already been under sustained scrutiny for some time by the UK Civil Aviation Authority. Now, if you're wondering why the UK regulators were overseeing an airline from a Mediterranean island country, well, it's because the UK had a number of military and administrative bases in Cyprus, but also because Cyprus's own aviation authority was very understaffed at the time and therefore had almost no actual oversight capability. Anyway, the UK CIA had conducted multiple audits on both the airline and its UK-based maintenance contractor ATC Lossam. And what they had found pointed to a company barely holding itself together on paper. Manuals were outdated, incomplete, or with unclear origin. And investigators were stunned to learn that Helios didn't even have a contract with Boeing to receive official documentation updates for their aircraft. Instead, updates had been passed along from the airplane's previous owners and then selectively applied at Helios's discretion. Management openly admitted that only changes deemed important were incorporated, which was a practice that probably captured the airline's broader safety culture. Auditors also uncovered evidence that scheduled flight times were routinely shortened on paper to avoid triggering crew duty time limits, a practice that risked chronic fatigue among its flight crews. And beyond that, the airline lacked any meaningful quality control system. Emergency equipment was missing or incomplete, and internal operational oversight was virtually non-existent, with frontline staff left to manage most of their problems on their own. These deficiencies appeared again and again in successive audits, with little sign of lasting correction. So by November of 2004, the UKCA had warned Helios that its air operator certificate would be revoked unless the issues were permanently fixed. The airline then narrowly avoided grounding by addressing the listed discrepancies just days before the deadline, but the underlying culture that had allowed those issues to exist in the first place remained unchanged. In that environment, time was always in short supply. Aircraft arrived late at night and departed again before dawn, and crews rotated quickly, so the maintenance windows were compressed into the few quiet hours that still existed between flights, and any delays rippled through the system with little room to absorb them. Now, nothing about that was particularly unusual for such a tiny low-cost carrier. But it also meant that every decision, inspection, and every sign-off mattered. From an operational and regulatory standpoint, though, Helios Airways existed in a kind of oversight, no man's land. Because since the airline was registered in Cyprus, the UK Civil Aviation Authority lacked the authority it needed to really enforce its findings. Helios was given failing grades on audits by the UKCA in 2003 music, and 2004 and 2005. And each time the UKCA merely informed the CRIAT authorities, who were so desperately understaffed that then they often just didn't follow up on these complaints, which just meant that Helios was allowed to continue operating despite a pattern of unresolved issues. By 2005, though, Helios had two relatively new Boeing 737-800s. One leased Airbus A320 and a slightly older but newly acquired 737-300 registered as 5 Bravo Delta Bravo Yankee. It had been built back in 1998 and had then been delivered to Dutch BA, where it flew until 2004 when it was registered in Cyprus and painted in delivery of Helios Airlines. It had been run hard with over 16,000 flight cycles in the very short few years that it had been operational. And almost from the moment that Helios had introduced it to its fleet, it had developed a reputation for persistent nagging, problems that never quite seemed to be resolved. And they all centered around the aircraft's pressurization system. Quite a few times, crews had reported odd behavior and noises, and music. Maintenance logs showed intermittent fault messages that appeared during climb just to disappear later. Music, leaving little clues behind for the engineers to troubleshoot once the airplane was back down on the ground. And on top of that, in the summer of 2005 alone, there had been 7 different maintenance write-ups related to the cooling system for the airplane's electronics, powered by the air conditioning packs. Those are the same machines who provide the aircraft with its pressurization. Now, these problems weren't just restricted to fault codes. They were often very physical, too. Cabin crew occasionally heard loud bangs near the rear of the aircraft. And on several flights, ice had been seen forming around the seal of the aft service door, which indicated that there was a leak big enough to let the cold outside air mix with the ambient air inside of the cabin. Now, none of those issues were directly dangerous on their own. They were more of a nuisance because a cabin air leak might sound serious, but the reality is that aircraft leaks pressurization all of the time through seals and the toilets. And as a crew, you kind of get used to it. Some aircraft almost develop their own unique personalities. And when you fly them often, which is the case on a small fleet, we pilots learn which airplanes run a little bit warmer than others, which ones throw nuisance messages, and which ones need a little bit extra attention before they're released back into service. But it should also be said that this aircraft had had some more serious maintenance history, too. In December of 2004, it had experienced a pressurization event serious enough to force the deployment of the oxygen masks in the cabin and demand an emergency descent. And that had happened after a series of bangs were heard and the flight attendant noticed a hole in one of the aft door seals large enough to put a hand through. Now, after that, the aircraft had landed safely and it was returned back to service after some repairs had been made. But as far as we could find, the exact cause for this hole appearing was never properly identified. And as far as the paperwork was concerned, the issue had been addressed properly. Now, I'm explaining all of this because the history of this aircraft and the way that the pilots and engineers dealt with it was most likely very relevant to what was soon about to happen. On the night of August 13th, 2005, 5 Bravo Delta Ravo Yankee was flying between London and Larnaca, Cyprus, when the cabin crew once again reported banging noises and ice buildup near the aft right passenger door. These banging sounds were most likely caused by air leaking past the damaged or stiffened door seal. At higher altitudes, pressurized air escaping through an imperfect seal can make the seals themselves flutter slightly, sticking and releasing or shifting against their fittings. This creates sharp, intermittent banging noises rather than the continuous hiss you would normally expect from a leak. For passengers, this was extremely unpleasant and unsettling. So after the flight, the cabin crew reported the issue to the pilots, who then entered a note into the aircraft's technical log. A note that would become the beginning of a chain of events leading up to this story. The captain wrote, "Aft service door requires a full inspection. As mentioned before, this wasn't unusual for this aircraft. But anything written into an aircraft's technical log must either be deferred according to approved procedures or repaired before the next flight." This meant the problem could no longer simply be ignored. When the aircraft arrived in Larnaca during the early hours of August 14th, only a few hours remained before its next scheduled departure. The following morning, the aircraft was supposed to carry more than 100 passengers to Athens before continuing onward to Prague. Whatever had caused the banging sounds and ice formation near the aft door need to be understood, inspected, and officially signed off before the aircraft could fly again. This created significant pressure on the overnight maintenance crew, led by a licensed British engineer who was already familiar with this aircraft and its history. From his perspective, the technical log entry pointed toward a familiar suspect. If air was leaking past the aft service door seal at cruise altitude, the cause was likely just an issue with that seal rather than something structural with the aircraft's fuselage. And this in music turn meant that the leak was subtle and intermittent. And more importantly, it was something that might not show up unless the airplane was pressurized. So the engineering team started by visually inspecting the aft service door from both the inside and outside, opening and closing it several times. They checked the seals, the latching mechanism, and the surrounding structure, but nothing obvious stood out. The door sealed itself as it should. It seated properly in the frame, and all of the seals around it appeared. Music intact, which was a little bit of a problem. You see, when a pressurization leak only appears at altitude, a simple walk around on the ground often just isn't enough to find it. At higher altitudes, the pressure difference between the inside and the outside of the cabin can be as high as 8.35 pounds per square inch, which means that there are thousands of kilos of air pressure pressing against the door and holding it closed. Now, rubber seals stiffen in the cold, so small imperfections can become significant, and a door that looks perfectly normal on the ramp can behave very differently once the aircraft clamps into the thin, frigid air in the cruise. But before we go any further here, it's probably worth explaining why all of this talk of seals and pressurization is so important. At cruising altitude, the air pressure outside an airliner is far too low for the human body to be able to function. Up there, our lungs can only process about a quarter of the oxygen that would be able to take up sea level. So without assistance, a person would lose consciousness in seconds. That assistance can either come from adding oxygen to the air we breathe or by artificially increasing the pressure. And since it's much more convenient to do the latter, that is what airliners do. But they don't fly around as perfectly sealed pressure vessels. Instead, airliners maintain this pressure by constantly pumping in compressed air and then carefully controlling how much of it is allowed to escape. Now, the goal isn't to mimic the pressure at sea level, but instead to hold at an equivalent altitude of around 6,000 to 8,000 feet, where passengers and crew can breathe normally, but without the pressure difference between the inside and the outside becoming so high that structural integrity can become a problem. Now, on most jet airliners, including the Boeing 737, the air needed to achieve this comes from the engines. This is music, known as bleed air, and it's tapped from the 5th and 9th stages of the engine's compressor. Music, where it's hot and highly pressurized. It's then cooled, conditioned, music, and routed into the cabin and cockpit through the help of 2 air conditioning packs. And after that, it then flows continuously through the fuselage and out through 3 different controllable openings: the exhaust port, the forward outflow valve, and the aft outflow valve. Now, just to make it simple, I will mainly talk about the aft out alpha valve here, since it's the most important one of those. So by opening or closing that one, the pressurization system can raise or lower the pressure inside of the cabin in a smooth and controlled way as the aircraft climbs and descends, and thereby alter the cabin altitude. So, for example, with the alpha valve open, the inside pressure goes down and the cabin altitude goes up, and vice versa. Now, as a side note here, investigators were later able to determine that the main outflow valve had been forced to compensate for leaks in the cabin by staying further closed than normal on all of the last 74 flights on this aircraft. Just pointing at those previous issues that I mentioned. In any case, during normal circumstances, the control of the cabin altitude happens automatically. The pilot just sets the intended cruise altitude and landing altitude in the pressurization panel, and the system then manages everything else, carefully controlling how much air leaves the cabin to maintain a safe and comfortable internal pressure. But there is also a manual setting which can be used if the two automatic controllers would fail. In that setting, the pilots can control the outflow valve manually whilst carefully monitoring the cabin altitude. And this will activate a green manual light on the panel. But having to do that is exceedingly rare. So in reality, the pressurization mode selector was almost always set to auto, which is worth remembering here. And that also takes us back to the engineers. So we're now trying to figure out what was wrong with that aft door. To test for leaks, in this case, around the door, the engineers made a decision to run a pressurization test. And to do that, they needed to increase the pressure inside of the cabin to 23 psi or 8.25 psi above the ambient pressure. That would create an environment similar to the pressure difference that the aircraft would encounter while flying at higher altitudes. And it was a fairly routine test to do. It was described step by step in the aircraft's maintenance manual. And in order to force pressurize the aircraft on the ground, the outflow valve now needed to be closed. So inside of the cockpit, the lead technician therefore moved the pressurization mode selector from auto over to manual, which allowed them to seal the cabin and control how the pressure increased. Bleed air from the auxiliary power unit was then routed through the air conditioning packs, and the cabin began to pressurize just as it would during a climb. The pressure rose gradually, and while one maintenance technician positioned himself in the cabin near the aft service door, another one stood outside on top of some stairs, listening closely for any telltale hissing, popping, or banging. Now, the test was carried out all of the way up to the normal operating pressure, and then beyond it until the aircraft's overpressure safety valve opened up at a designated pressure differential of 8.65 psi. But even after having done that, they still found nothing and just couldn't replicate the issues that the plane had been having on the previous music flight. Now, in one sense, this was good news. The airplane appeared structurally sound, and there was no obvious defect demanding immediate repair, but in another, it was deeply frustrating. The problem that this cabin crew had reported was something that had now been documented several times, but had once again failed to reveal itself under control conditions. So with no fault to fix, the engineers began depressurizing the aircraft, carefully managing the rate to avoid discomfort for those inside. And that was especially after one technician had already complained that they were descending too fast and that his ears were hurting. Now, it was later found that this test had not been done exactly according to the description in the maintenance manual. The test pressure had been run too high and with the use of 2 packs instead of 1, and the engineer at the back had not been provided with a copy of the task showing exactly what he was supposed to look for. In any case, once they were done, the test was completed and documented in the log book, albeit not in the detailed way that it should have been. An engineer in charge then signed off that the aft service door and its surroundings had no music defects, at least that they could detect, and that the pressurization system had performed exactly as expected. By the time that he had filled that in, the night was already over and the aircraft was released back into service. So the maintenance crew just moved on to their next task, confident that they had done what the situation required. But one small detail had been left out of place, one that would soon matter more than anyone could ever imagine. Now, exactly what happened here is up for some debate, because the chief engineer insisted that he finish this test by switching the pressurization mode selector from manual back into auto. But all evidence, including how the system later performed and how the switch was eventually found, point to the switch having been left in manual, which would mean that the cabin alpha valve would still be under manual control and would therefore not allow normal automatic pressurization unless it was put back into auto again. By the time the engineers had finished everything and stepped away from the aircraft, the night was already giving way to morning. Darnak Airport on the south side of the island of Cyprus was just beginning to stir, and among the first arrivals to the airport that morning were the crew who was going to operate Helios Flight 522. Now, according to their schedule, they were supposed to fly the 737 first through a short hop from Cyprus over to Athens, and then onwards towards Prague, making it a pretty nice duty overall. Now, the pilots who had been scheduled to operate this duty were fairly experienced. The captain was 59 years old and had 16,900 hours, and with 5,500 of those being flown on the 737. He had started his career in East Germany and had, during the years before this flight, shifted companies almost every other year, which for someone like me raises a few questions. You see, generally you only change airlines that often, either if you're very unlucky or because there's some other problem present like training issues or CRM. Now he was described by his family as a quiet person who liked to build and fly model airplanes. But some first officers in Helios had complained about his manners in the cockpit, specifically that he could be a bit harsh and that he sometimes didn't follow standard operating procedures. His first officer on this day, who was one of the ones who had privately complained about this captain, by the way, was 51 years old and had an experience of just over 7,500 hours, 4,000 of which were flown on the 737. He had started his career as a mechanic before he was bitten by the bug and eventually became a first officer on the Lougheed Electra. Now, while he was qualified and quite experienced, his training records noted that he sometimes struggled a bit with discipline and attention to details, was going through checklists, especially under stress. Anyway, for both of these pilots, this should have been a quite routine day. The weather was excellent. There were no specific notes, and a maintenance log showed no open items that would prevent dispatch. It is, however, unclear if the captain noticed the tech log entries left from the night's tests, and we do know that there was no normal or formal handoff from the lead engineer, meaning that he didn't come out and explain things to the captain as would normally be done. Anyway, the pilots were also joined on the flight by 4 cabin crew, including one that had been called off from standby to fill in for a colleague that had been calling in sick, and together with 115 passengers. This brought the total souls on board up to 121 for the first flight. From the cockpit, nothing at this point would have appeared unusual. The first officer who would be pilot flying started setting up the aircraft whilst the captain did the walk-hound, and the initial cockpit preparation, of course, included configuring all of the key systems, including the air conditioning system, as well as programming the FMC with a complete routing that they were planning to use. Now, going through the pre-flight setup is a highly routine task to do on the 737. It includes several scan flows which are done from memory in a certain order stipulated by Boeing. And whilst every movement of a switch and check of a light requires careful attention, it is often done in quite a rapid fashion, especially if there is some type of time pressure present, which means that there is a big risk of things becoming a bit too routine. So switches not in the correct position could be missed if you don't pay full attention, or if it's a switch who is rarely touched, or some other type of destruction is introduced. In any case, the idea is that any omission in a critical system should then be highlighted by the use of our checklist. And in the case of the pre-flight checklist, they contained around 80 different items, several of which did cover the pressurization panel. But here we come to one of many peculiarities of the boring 737. You see the checklist item used for the life-up supporting pressurization system used the challenge air condition and pressurization, effectively covering 2 whole panels with the same challenge. Now the response from the pilot flying to that challenge should be PAC's auto bleeds on set. And the set there was supposed to include both the cruise and landing altitude on the pressurization panel and the position of the pressurization mode selector. But since that switch almost never was anywhere else than in the auto position, a lot of crews just concentrated on the values that they had manually entered in the 2 windows instead and not on the switch. But of course, on this morning, the pressurization mode selector was not an auto. It was still set to manual, exactly where it had been left after the overnight pressure test. And that now went unnoticed. Oh, and by the way, remember those updates to manuals that Helios hadn't bothered to apply because they didn't think that they were important? Well, one of those would have rewritten the before start checklist to explicitly require verification of the pressurization mode selector's position rather than just that vague pressurization set. Now, another reason why the crew might not have reacted to the manual position was, like I mentioned earlier, that the manual light which illuminated next to the switch when it was in the manual position was green, which is the color normally associated with normal operation rather than any type of danger. Investigators also noted that with the first officers sometimes recorded poor attention to detail, he might have called set without the actual position of the switch ever being truly processed. And exactly for that reason, checklists are only effective when they are paired with proper verification by both pilots. So rhyming of checklists, which is when you just call out what the response should be rather than what it actually is a big problem in the business and something that I have spent countless hours instructing new pilots on in the sim. Unfortunately, though, in this aircraft, the cockpit voice recorder only captured the last 30 minutes of the conversations. So it therefore didn't cover this phase of flight, which means that the investigators were never able to determine exactly how the pressurization mode selector escaped detection. But we do know that it was left in manual. And so after the checklist had been completed, the two engines were started in sequence, and the air conditioning packs were put to auto to start providing air for the air conditioning and pressurization. And this caused the bleed air to start flowing into the aircraft just as it always did, making all of the familiar sounds that the pilots were used to. Nothing suggested that the system responsible for keeping the cabin breathable at altitude was now still in manual control. But even though these first important checks had now been missed, there were still several more safety barriers left, specifically designed to stop on a mission like this from becoming dangerous. And for them to also be passed, further mistakes, and another curiosity of the 737 systems needed to enter the scene. Helios Flight 522 soon taxied out from its stand under the warm morning sun. The pilots were subsequently cleared for departure, and at time 0807, the aircraft lined up on runway 22. The first officer moved the thrust levers forward, and the gleaming 737 started accelerating smoothly down the runway and then rotated into the air. The gear was then retracted, and the aircraft started banking gently away from the runway, pointing the nose northwest towards Greece. The climb was smooth with no clear indication of anything being out of the ordinary. The air was calm, and from the cockpit perspective, everything still, music, appeared routine. All of the engine parameters were normal. The autopilot was engaged, and the aircraft accelerated cleanly through its initial climb and retracted the flaps. But this normality was music just off-a-cade. As the 737 continued climbing, the air pressure outside was slowly decreasing as it always did. But with the pressurization system still in manual mode, the electrically operated outflow valve now remained partially open, allowing air to escape from the cabin almost as fast as it was being pumped in, like a giant balloon with a hole in it. Now, under normal circumstances, this should not have gone unnoticed for long. The after take-up checklist includes a specific step where we pilots need to verify that the cabin pressurization is occurring normally. And we do so by checking the cabin altitude, the differential pressure, and the cabin rate of climb indications on the pressurization panel. During a normal climb, the cabin altitude of the takeoff should have just increased a little tiny bit, whilst the differential pressure should be increasing steadily, and the cabin climb would sit at around 500 to 1,000 feet per minute. But with the aircraft not pressurizing, the cabin altitude would be similar to the aircraft's actual altitude, and there would be little to no differential pressure. And on top of that, the cabin climb rate would also be similar to the aircraft's, sitting at around 2,500 to 3,000 feet per minute if the aircraft was still climbing. So for this flight to continue climbing with the system still misconfigured, that important check must now have also completely failed. As with the earlier checklist items, the cockpit voice recorder didn't capture this phase of flight either. So investigators were unable to determine exactly how this was missed. The only thing that they could determine was that one more chance to catch this problem had now come and gone. This time with the captain in charge of doing the checklist, as he was pilot monitoring. Now, at first, the differences that this would have caused in the cabin would have been quite subtle. Passengers and crew would have noticed nothing unusual, except maybe some more noticeable pops in their ears and sinuses as the cabin